Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing the colonial conflicts fought by European powers in the 1950s and the 1960s as they sought to keep their empires together. It is a myth that Europeans simply relinquished power to their colonies. Instead, the end of empire was often a bloody affair which left behind deep legacies of hatred between colonizer and colonized. The term "dirty war" comes from the name French people gave to the war fought to keep Vietnam as part of the French Empire. The French war in Vietnam was in many ways the archetypal colonial war of the post-war period. As we saw in the last lecture, Vietnam had been under a brutal Japanese occupation during the Second World War, and the Japanese soldiers in the country were widely hated. The majority of the Vietnamese, however, had no wish to see the French restored to power in their country. Vietnamese patriot and communist Ho Chi Minh, who had waged an irregular or guerrilla war against the Japanese from the Vietnamese jungles, declared Vietnamese independence on September 2nd, 1945. In his speech, Ho Chi Minh attempted to appeal directly for American support by stating, "We hold the truth that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The French, however, were determined to restore their colony and, with the aid of the British, seized control of the south of Vietnam and the city of Saigon. Thus, at the beginning of 1946, there were two Vietnams, a communist north ruled from Hanoi and a non-communist south. Despite a period of negotiation and tactical cooperation between the French and the supporters of Ho Chi Minh, who were known as the Viet Minh, their policies were irreconcilable. The French aimed to re-establish colonial rule, whilst Hanoi wanted total independence. In late November 1946, French naval vessels bombarded the port city of Haiphong, causing several thousand civilian casualties. The subsequent Viet Minh attempt to overwhelm French troops stationed in Hanoi began a period of outright war. The French, who restored the Vietnamese puppet emperor to his throne, were confident of victory thanks to their superior technology and their support of educated Christian Vietnamese in the large cities. The French, however, overlooked the lengths that the Vietnamese would go to in order to ensure the independence of their country. Striking from the jungles of North Vietnam, the Viet Minh were able to destroy a number of isolated French garrisons. French soldiers went out on patrols and pacified an area, only to have that area flip back to supporting the Viet Minh once they had left. As casualties mounted, the morale of the French troops sagged. The victory of the Communists in the Chinese Civil War gave the Viet Minh an important ally to the north, one which supplied Ho Chi Minh with supplies. The US, meanwhile, financed the French war, pumping money into the French military in order to prevent what US officials considered to be a communist takeover of Vietnam. Eventually, the French came up with an audacious plan to establish a fortress deep within the jungle and supply it via aeroplane. From this fortress at Dien Bien Phu, French soldiers could, in theory, draw out guerrilla forces from the jungle and win a decisive victory. Dien Bien Phu ended in calamity for the French. The fortress was surrounded by large hills where the Vietnamese, to the surprise of everyone, were able to drag a number of large artillery pieces using nothing but human strength and intuition. With their artillery on the hills, the Viet Minh were able to rain down attacks on the French in their fortress and destroy the planes that were meant to supply them. The French fortress surrendered in May 1954, and when it did, the French dreams of controlling Vietnam came to an end. Two Vietnams were now established, a communist dictatorship in the north and a capitalist dictatorship in the south, but now it would be the USA, not France, that would take up the burden of supporting the war against Ho Chi Minh. Vietnam would not be reunited until a communist victory and takeover of the South in 1975. The British, meanwhile, were fighting numerous dirty wars of their own. In Palestine, pressures that were building up before the Second World War and the Holocaust now became unbearable as millions of Jewish refugees flocked to the colony in order to escape the horrors occurring in Europe. The British government had, before the war, proposed the partition of Palestine into two Arab and Jewish states. When this was rejected by the Arabs, London decided in 1939 to restrict Jewish immigration severely in the hope that the UK would retain Arab support in the war. After the war, the British came under pressure by Zionists and their sympathizers, especially President Truman in the United States, to admit the desperate remnant of the European Jews into Palestine. They were equally pressured by local and regional Arab opponents of a Jewish state to put an end to all immigration. Both sides, Arab and Jewish, violently assailed the garrison in Palestine of the British. The ordinary British soldiers, many of whom had fought in the Second World War and were desperate to go home, had extremely low morale and were fighting against Jewish and Arab forces highly committed to their causes. "British Go Home" wrote a piece of graffiti under which was written the reply, "I bloody well wish I could." The Zionist militias stepped up their efforts in 1946, bombing the Hotel David, which housed the British High Command, in a high-profile event. The British, just like in India, gave up and handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to divide British-ruled Palestine into two states, one Jewish and the other Arab. This decision was immediately opposed by the Arabs who attacked Jewish people throughout Palestine as the British withdrew. The fighting was savage and many civilians were slain. The Jewish state, Israel, then came under attack from all of its Arab neighbors in 1948, but somehow managed to defeat them all in a short war. The British enjoyed greater success in Southeast Asia, where they successfully defeated a communist-led insurgency in Malaya. The uprising was mostly undertaken by Chinese living in Malaya and lacked widespread support of the local people. The British success came not so much from the use of force, instead promises of reform and an active attempt to address political and economic grievances isolated the rebels from the rest of the Malayan public. The Dutch, in contrast, attempted to use force alone to defeat an insurgency in their colonies. They were largely unsuccessful in crushing dissent and were forced by the UN to negotiate with the insurgents. The new nation of Indonesia won its independence in 1949. Whilst the Europeans' Asian colonies were the first to wage independent struggles, the African colonies soon followed. The Mau Mau were a militant African nationalist movement that originated in the 1950s among the Kikuyu people of Kenya. The Mau Mau advocated violent resistance to British domination in Kenya and the murder of white settlers who dominated the best land and wealth in the colony. In 1950, the Mau Mau were banned by British authorities, and in October 1952, after a campaign of sabotage and assassination attributed to Mau Mau terrorists, the British Kenyan government declared a state of emergency and begun a dirty war which lasted for 4 years. Whilst the Mau Mau were undoubtedly a violent organisation, the British response was extremely heavy-handed and involved numerous massacres of civilians, as well as the forced relocation of Kikuyu and the use of concentration camps. Kenya would eventually win independence in 1963, but a series of compromises allowed many whites to keep their land, whilst others sold theirs to the new Kenyan elite. The French now faced a massive uprising of their own in their oldest African colony, Algeria. The French considered Algeria a part of metropolitan France, and it was thus even more important to them than Vietnam was. Having said that, the Muslim Arab majority who lived in Algeria did not enjoy the same political rights and economic opportunities that the country's Francophile Christians had. The war for Algerian independence began in October 1954, just as French rule in Vietnam was coming to an end. The independence forces, led by the newly formed National Liberation Front, or FLN, issued a leaflet stating that their aim was to restore a sovereign Algerian state. They advocated social democracy within an Islamic framework and equal citizenship for any resident in Algeria. The document recognized that Algeria had fallen behind other Arab states in social and national emancipation, but claimed that this could be remedied by a difficult and prolonged struggle. Two weapons would be used in the war with the French: guerrilla warfare at home and diplomatic activity abroad, particularly at the United Nations. The armed uprising soon intensified and spread, gradually affecting larger parts of the country, and some regions, notably in the mountains, became guerrilla strongholds that were completely beyond French control. France became more and more involved in the conflict, drafting 2 million conscripts over the course of the war. To counter the uprising, the French Fourth Republic declared a state of emergency, first over the affected provinces, and later that year over the entire country. A decisive turn in the war took place in August 1955 when a widespread armed outbreak in Skikda, north of the Constantine region, led to the killing of nearly 100 Europeans and Muslim officials. Countermeasures by both the French army and the white settlers claimed the lives of thousands of Algerians. The socialists were elected in Paris, in part due to dissatisfaction with the war being fought. When the socialist prime minister visited Algeria, however, he was pelted with tomatoes by white settlers for his policies, which were supposedly too moderate. A French army of 500,000 troops was sent to Algeria to counter the rebel strongholds in the more distant portions of the country, whilst the rebels collected money for their cause and took reprisals against Muslims who would not cooperate with them. The French then gave Morocco and Tunisia their independence in order to focus on the struggle in Algeria. Beginning in 1956 and continuing until the summer of the following year, the FLN attempted to paralyze the administration in Algiers through what has become known as the Battle of Algiers. Attacks by the FLN against both military and civilian Europeans were countered by French paratroopers. The French resorted to torture and summary execution of hundreds of suspects. The entire leadership of the FLN was eventually eliminated or forced to flee. The French also cut Algeria off from Tunisia and Morocco by erecting barbed wire fences that were illuminated at night by searchlights. This separated the Algerian resistance within the country from some 30,000 armed Algerians who occupied positions between the fences and the frontiers of Tunisia and Morocco, from which they drew supplies. In May 1958, thousands of white French settlers attacked the offices of the French Governor-General in Algeria and, with the approval of army officers, called for the full integration of Algeria within France and for the return of de Gaulle to power. The following month, de Gaulle visited Algiers amid scenes of great enthusiasm. He granted all Muslims the full rights of French citizenship, and on October the 30th, while in Constantine, he announced a plan to provide adequate schools and medical services for the Algerian population, to create employment for them, and to introduce them into the higher ranks of the civil service. De Gaulle then shocked the white settlers the following September when he publicly declared the Algerians had the right to determine their own future. The settler population responded by staging a fresh uprising in January 1960, but this collapsed after 9 days from lack of military support. A year later there was another uprising, this time organized by 4 generals. De Gaulle remained unshaken, and the rising, lacking support from the army, collapsed after only 3 days. A referendum held in Algeria in July 1962 recorded some 6 million votes in favor of independence and only 16,000 against. After 3 days of continuous Algerian rejoicing, the independence fighters entered Algiers in triumph as many Europeans prepared to depart. In the giant Belgian Congo, which dominated the center of Africa, a class of westernized Africans eager to exercise their political rights had arisen. Heavy demands made upon the rural masses during the 2 world wars, coupled with the profound psychological impact of reform introduced in neighboring French territories, created a climate of social unrest suited for the development of nationalism. Nationalist sentiment spread through the Lower Congo region, and in time the nationalist wave washed over the rest of the colony. With the arrival of Patrice Lumumba, a powerful orator and advocate of Pan-Africanism, in the capital of Leopoldville in 1958, the conflict entered a militant phase. Anti-European rioting erupted in Leopoldville, resulting in the death of scores of Africans at the hands of security forces. On January 13th, the Belgian government formally recognized independence as the ultimate goal of its policies. By then, however, nationalist agitation had reached a level of intensity that made it impossible for the colonial administration to control the course of events. The Belgian government responded to the growing turbulence by inviting a spectrum of nationalist organizations to a roundtable conference in Brussels in January 1960. 6 months later, on June 30th, the Congo formally became independent and then quickly descended into chaos. The failure of the Europeans in their dirty wars was due to a number of factors. Firstly, the European armies and economies, even in victorious Britain, had been decimated during the Second World War. Secondly, there was much popular unrest to the wars in Europe itself, especially as conscripts were sent abroad to fight in places they knew or cared little about. Thirdly, educated nationalists from the colonies were able to effectively lead and organize independence movements. Many of these independence heroes were ideologically committed to the struggle, not only due to their nationalism, but also due to having socialist beliefs which preached the evil of capitalist empire. Lastly, the UN proved an effective tool to shame the Europeans for any oppressive action taken in their colonies. As more and more states achieved independence, pressure in the UN intensified on those remaining Europeans clinging to power in some colonies.